In 2012, a team of researchers fed a tiny camera up through the nose of a woman who had been dead for about 2,400 years. They pushed it past the nostril, up into the hollow behind her face, all the way to the inside of her skull, and sitting in there, wedged against the bone, was something that should not exist. A thin wooden rod, snapped off at one end, locked in place by resin that had hardened around it like amber. Someone had left a tool inside her head, and then sealed her up for eternity with it still in there. Here is the part that gets stranger the longer you look at it. The Egyptians pulled this woman's brain out through her nose, and then they threw it away, in the garbage. Meanwhile, her stomach, her lungs, her liver, her intestines, those they washed by hand, dried, and tucked into beautiful sealed jars to keep forever. The brain, the thing inside your head right now following these words, was treated like trash. Sit with that, because it does not make sense yet. And it gets worse for the version of this story you have probably heard. Almost everything we repeat about the brain and the nose comes from one ancient Greek tourist, and there is a very good chance he got the most famous detail wrong. They probably never pulled the brain out at all. One more thing, and then I will start explaining. This same civilization, the one that tossed the brain in the trash, also wrote down the first description of the human brain in all of recorded history. They knew what it was. They had even noticed what it did, and they threw it out anyway. By the end of this, all three of those things are going to lock into a single answer. And that answer says more about how the Egyptians saw death than about how they took a body apart. So let me put you in the room. It is somewhere around 3,000 years ago. A body is lying on a sloped stone table, feet angled downward so fluids can run off. The smell is already bad. In Egypt's heat, a corpse begins to turn within hours, and the embalmers are in a race they cannot afford to lose. The man leaning over the head is not a doctor in any sense you would recognize. He works a trade that is half surgery and half religion. In his hand is a long, thin instrument, and he slides it into the left nostril, not the right, almost always the left, and hold on to that, because that detail matters more than you would guess. He pushes. At the top of the nasal cavity sits a thin, delicate plate of bone called the ethmoid. It is honeycombed and fragile, about as thick as a cracker. He drives the tool through it with a small tap, and now he has a doorway. A tunnel running straight from the nose into the skull, into the place where the brain sits. Most of what people quote about what happens next comes from a Greek writer named Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century before Christ and wrote it all down like a fascinated tourist. His line, the one that ended up in 1,000 textbooks, is blunt. They draw out the brain through the nostrils with an iron hook, he wrote, and whatever the hook cannot reach, they rinse out with drugs. An iron hook up the nose, pulling out the brain. That is the image that stuck for 2,500 years. A little hook, fishing pieces of brain out through a nostril. And here is where the story you were told starts to fall apart. Because if you have ever seen what a brain actually is, you know it does not behave like something you can hook and pull. It is soft, closer to set custard or wet tofu than to anything solid. Try to snag it with a hook and drag it out through a hole the width of a pencil, and it just tears and smears. You would be there for hours, and you would barely get any of it out. Modern researchers tested this directly. An archaeologist named Stephen Buckley, who has spent years rebuilding exactly how the Egyptians worked, found something almost comically simple. You do not pull the brain out. You scramble it. Put the rod in, whisk it around for about 20 minutes, and the brain breaks down into liquid. Then you turn the body, tip the head, and it pours out through the nose on its own. Gravity does the work. And back in 1994, a researcher named Bob Breyer tried something almost nobody had attempted in 2,000 years. He and a colleague mummified a real donated human body using only the tools and methods the Egyptians had. When they reached the brain, the account is grimly clear. They broke through, they worked the tissue loose, and when they rolled the body over, the brain simply ran out. So that famous hook was probably never a fishing rod for brain matter. It was a whisk, and maybe a scraper for the lining of the skull. The dramatic picture of someone reeling a whole brain out through a nostril is mostly a myth. Once the skull was empty, the embalmers finished the head in different ways. Some rinsed it out, some packed it with linen soaked in resin, and some poured warm liquid resin straight in through the nose, let it cool, and sealed the head solid from the inside. Then the entire body was buried in a mound of natron, a natural drying salt, and left there for around 40 days until every drop of moisture was gone. From the first cut to the final bandage, the whole thing took about 70 days, which brings us back to the woman from the very beginning, and the thing left inside her head. When those researchers in 2012 ran her through a scanner, they saw an object lodged at the back of her skull, fused into hardened resin, exactly the kind of resin poured in to seal the head. They could not tell what it was at first, so they threaded a camera inside to look. It turned out to be a rod about 8 centimeters long, made from a plant, the same sort of organic tool used to break up and clear out the brain. It had most likely snapped during the procedure, and the embalmer either never noticed or never managed to dig the broken piece back out. So they finished the job, wrapped her, and buried her, with their own tool still sitting inside her head. It stayed there for around 2,400 years, until a machine finally found it. It is one of only a couple of cases like it ever recorded, and honestly, that is the whole reason I keep doing this. A single mistake from 24 centuries ago, still physically trapped inside someone's skull, just waiting for the right scan to catch it. If that is the kind of thing you want more of, go ahead and subscribe, because there is always another body on the table and another detail nobody mentions. Now back to the real mystery, because we still have not answered the actual question. Why throw the brain away in the first place? Here is what makes the brain stand out. The Egyptians were not careless people. They were meticulous. When they opened the body through a cut on the left side of the abdomen, they carefully lifted out the stomach, the intestines, the lungs, and the liver. They cleaned each one, dried it, and placed it in its own container, the jars we now call canopic jars. 4 organs, 4 jars, each one watched over by its own god. These things mattered to them. They believed you needed your body whole to live again, so they preserved the pieces with real care. And the heart, they almost always left exactly where it was, inside the chest, on purpose. So look at the scoreboard. Lungs, saved. Liver, saved. Stomach and intestines, saved. Heart kept in the body and treated as the single most important thing in there. And the brain, whisked into liquid and poured out onto the floor. Why is the brain the one organ in the entire body that gets no jar, no god, and no respect at all? The answer is that the Egyptians thought the brain was basically useless. To them, you did not think with your head, you thought with your heart. The heart was the center of everything that made you who you were. Your intelligence, your memory, your personality, your conscience, your will. When they imagined the seat of the soul, they did not point at the skull, they pointed at the chest. The brain, as far as they were concerned, was little more than stuffing. Some of their writings barely mention it, and this was not just a quaint opinion. It decided whether you got to exist forever. The Egyptians believed that after death, you were led into a great hall to be judged. Your heart was placed on one side of a huge scale. On the other side sat a single feather, the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and order. The jackal-headed god Anubis worked the balance. Thoth, the god with the head of an ibis, stood ready to record the result. And the question being asked was simple. Had you lived a good life or a heavy one? If your heart balanced against the feather, you passed and you lived again. If your heart came up heavier, weighed down by everything you had done wrong, then a creature was waiting right beside the scale. They called her Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippo, the 3 animals an Egyptian feared most, fused into one body. And she ate the heart, not the body, the heart. and that was the end of you, not torment, erasure, a second death, with nothing at all on the other side. So now follow the embalmer's logic. The organ that decides your entire eternity is the heart, so you guard it like treasure and leave it in the chest where it can be weighed. The brain plays no part in any of that. It is not weighed, it is not judged, it does not speak for you. So why would you waste precious resin and a sacred jar on a gray lump that does nothing for the soul? You take it out so the head will not rot, and you throw it away. And remember the left nostril. That was not random either. The body was laid out with the head pointing north, which put the work on the eastern side. East was the direction of sunrise, the side the sun returned from every single morning, the direction of rebirth itself. Even the angle of a tool going up a dead person's nose was lined up with their idea of coming back to life. Nothing here was casual. Every cut carried a meaning. So, why did the Egyptians pull the brain out through the nose? Put all of it together, and the answer comes in two layers. The first layer is brutally practical. The brain is mostly fat and water, and it rots faster than almost anything else in the body. Leave it sealed inside a skull in desert heat, and it turns to liquid, it swells, and it destroys the face from the inside. And the face was everything. The Egyptians believed the soul had to come back and recognize its own body, find its own face, in order to live again. A collapsed, rotted face meant a soul with no home to return to, so the brain came out to protect the head, the same way the organs came out to protect the torso. Pure preservation. The second layer is the one that truly answers the question. They discarded the brain, and only the brain, because in their entire map of what a person is, the brain pointed to nothing. The self lived in the heart. So the heart stayed behind for judgment, and the head was just a container to be cleaned out and kept presentable. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you. The Egyptians were not blind to the brain. We have a medical document from them, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, written more than 3,000 years ago. It holds the oldest written description of the human brain anywhere on Earth, the folds on its surface, the membranes wrapped around it, the fluid inside. And whoever wrote it had noticed something remarkable. They recorded that an injury to a man's head could change what happened in the rest of his body. That damage up here could leave a limb down there unable to move. They were standing right at the edge of understanding that the brain controls the body, and they wrote it down. And then, in the ritual that mattered to them more than any other, the one that decided who lived forever, they took that same brain, turned it to liquid, and poured it out onto the floor, not because they had never looked at it, because they had already decided it was not where a person lives. That woman from 2012, with a broken tool sealed inside her skull, was not the work of clumsy savages. She was prepared by people following a system so precise and so certain about where the soul lived that they would protect a stomach in a sacred jar and discard a brain without a second thought. They were not throwing away a mind. In their world, they were throwing out the packing material and keeping the only thing that counted, which leaves one question still hanging in that hall. What actually happened to the people whose hearts came up too heavy, the ones the scale rejected, the ones fed to Amit? The Egyptians had very specific ideas about that, and somehow it is darker than a brain pulled through the nose. That is the next one. Stay with me and I will show you exactly what they believed was waiting on the other side of a failed heart.